Good evening. I welcome you on the behalf of Countryside Community Church and the Center for Faith Studies to our second lecture of the programming year to hear Joe Starita. Boy, does he ever have a wonderful and inspiring story to tell. Really, it's, as he himself has said, it's a story of Omaha, it's a story of Nebraska, it's really a story also of America. And I would add it's a story of our humanity that unfolds in the story of Chief Standing Bear. Just a couple of items before we begin. If you are new to the church, I want to especially welcome you here if you're a first-timer. And just a couple of things to note then. If you need the restrooms, they're out and to the left again. And also after the lecture tonight, we'll have some goodies and beverages out in the foyer area. We'd love to have you stick around for some conversation. Also, if you happen to have one of these cell phone things in your pocket, if you will kindly turn that to off or vibrate, that would be appreciated. And at this time, I'd like to invite up our interim director for the Center for Faith Studies, Margaret McGrath, who will introduce our speaker.
I join with Dr. Elmas and everyone here at Countryside Community Church to welcome you all to tonight's presentation. If you've been here before, whether in person or online in our community at Darkwood Brew, we're glad to see you back. And if this is your first time, we certainly hope to see you again. With that in mind, allow me to draw your attention to the upcoming Center for Faith Studies events listed in your program. If you would like to be on our email list, please stop by the ticket desk in the foyer and fill out a card to receive periodic updates and reminders. If you would like to view this lecture again after this evening or share it with friends and family, it should be up on the Center for Faith Studies website within a few days. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize a few very special people. First and foremost, let's give our guest, Joe Starita, a warm welcome. I'd also like to thank the volunteers from the Center for Faith Studies Committee who give so generously of their time and talents to host these events. If you have any questions, please see a volunteer with a blue ribbon and they will be happy to help you. At the end of Joe's presentation, we will have a time for questions and answers. If you will raise your hand, an usher with a microphone will come to you. Please do use the microphone so that Joe and the other guests can hear you. We will also have a time for discussion while enjoying refreshments in the foyer afterwards, where Joe will be signing books. Recognizing that the issues we face today are rooted in events from the distant and not so distant past, tonight the Center for Faith Studies continues a series devoted to exploring the theme of reconciliation. In Joe Starita, we have a storyteller who has dedicated his career as a journalist and an author to both shining a light on the systemic injustices perpetrated against those we might prefer to ignore or forget, as well as the moments when communities come together in new and fruitful ways to make vital progress towards the ideals of liberty and justice for all. In telling these stories, he holds space for us to engage in deep listening, seeking to find common ground in our shared humanity and endeavoring to bridge the gaps that divide us. We are so very grateful for your presence tonight as we continue this conversation around the mysterious and crucial concept of reconciliation. Please help me welcome Joe Starita to the podium.
The first thing I thought when I stood up here and tested the mic was how many friends I have who would find the juxtaposition of me on a church stage so fraught with irony they would not be able to absorb all of it. But I think authors in general are guilty of two transgressions, and I'm going to mention the first one now, and I'll weave in the second one a little bit later. The first one of which is I am genuinely honored, and I find it a privilege to be able to speak to you tonight. And I'm also struck instantly looking out, there's nobody with their head down and their thumbs furiously twitching. I'm not used to this. I teach college classes. So it's fun to speak to fully formed adults. Thank you very much for being fully formed adults who still value reading. And in this crazy world where tsunami waves of busyness wash over us, you still have found time to carve out a slot and to buy a book, perhaps to read a book, and to come and hear somebody talk about a book. So I don't want to commit that indiscretion that I think a lot of authors do, and I want you to know right up front that I am very, very honored for this large a turnout in our busy, busy lives. So thank you very much for showing up. It is much appreciated. Here are the rules for tonight. This is going to be very conversational. I don't have any stone tablets, nothing carved out. I have some very strong thoughts. I have some things to say about this man and his story that I think resonate just as much in the opening years of the 21st century as they did in the waning years of the 19th. But here's the deal. Are there any lawyers in the room, by the way? 2 lawyers in the room. Okay, that makes it even better. So 3. So the deal is that you can enforce an oral contract, right? Am I correct? Okay. We're going to have an oral contract to start this program, and that oral contract goes something like this. I am going to tell you some things I feel strongly about this book and this story. I'm going to go for about 40 minutes, and then I expect this room to hear some of the most brilliantly insightful questions and comments that this room has ever heard. Do we have a deal? Okay, we got a deal. Excellent. Okay. We need good stories. We, mankind, womankind, humankind, we need good stories. We have always needed good stories. From the caves of Lascaux in the southwest corner of France, where there are pictographs on the walls of those caves that have been carbon dated back 17,400 years, pictographs that tell the story, a story about a specific group of people living in a specific place at a specific time. We need those stories. We need the stories of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We need the stories of Virgil, Homer, Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, Dostoevsky, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Norman Mailer. And for my money, the best American writer we have going right now, Miss Louise Erdrich, an Ojibwe woman from Minneapolis. We need those stories because those stories collectively, from the caves of Lascaux to the Roundhouse that won the National Book Award, first Native American woman ever to win the National Book Award last year, we need all of those stories because knowing who we were yesterday helps inform who we are today and foreshadows who we are going to become tomorrow. That's how important those stories are. And those stories cannot be told in 140 characters, despite what my students think. Can't be done. John Adams, second president of the United States, kind of below the radar when you talk about the founding fathers. He was very interesting. He was very unique. He refused to have slaves. So I can only buy the historical revisionism so much, so far. He refused to have slaves because in the opening years of the 1800s, he thought it was morally wrong to have slaves. John Adams also was a prolific, insanely prolific letter writer. If you took every letter in cursive that John Adams wrote in his lifetime and you stood them end to end, they would stretch more than 5 miles. So if I'm David McCulloch and I want to do a biography of John Adams, think of the depths of the repository of material that I have to fall back on. Now, 50, 60, 80 years from now, I'm pretty sure you might be able to sit tweets side by side and get 5 miles out of it, but it would be a 1/16 of an inch deep. So I worry about biographers of the future who are not going to have 5 miles of letters to dig into. I got off track a little bit, but that's not unusual. So I want to tell you not only how important stories are, but how important I think this story is. I want to tell you a story about a man, a middle-aged, devoted father, the chief of a small, obscure tribe, hunkered down in a remote corner of the northern Great Plains, who defeated the United States government, who brought the United States Army to its knees without ever firing a shot from his Winchester, without ever plucking an arrow from his quiver, without ever unshielding his sheathing knife. He did it with a writ of habeas corpus on the second floor of a monolithic limestone courthouse that in the late spring of 1879 occupied the block at 15th and Dodge Streets where the Doubletree Hotel is now. It's an astounding story. It's an astounding story of what this man and his sheer humanity did to this courtroom over 2 full days, the first 2 days of May 1879. I also want to tell you not only the narrative arc of this story, but I want to weave in 3 reasons why I love this story. There are more, but 3 specific reasons why I love this story so much. Why I would routinely get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 below, 6 inches of snow on the ground, because I would be laying in bed and I would be obsessing over a paragraph, maybe a sentence that I'd written 12 hours earlier. And I wanted this sentence, I wanted this phrase, I wanted this paragraph to sound like Luciano Pavarotti. But it sounded more like Roseanne Barr singing the Star-Spangled Banner. Who can sleep with that rattling around in your head? So I didn't. I would get up, I would put on a pot of coffee, I would click on my word processor, and I would start fiddling with the rhythm and the cadence of that sentence until I was satisfied that it would drive the Star-Spangled Banner from Roseanne Barr out of my head and I could go back to sleep. Is there anybody in here who owns a farm, owns property in the country? Yes, okay. And you are? Yeah, you.
Kelly.
You're Kelly. And what do you own?
We own timber and creek and native prairie now that we've established.
Okay, and you are the owner of that property?
Yes.
How many acres?
13.
13? How long have you had it?
17 years.
17 years. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of a pacer. Kelly, if you woke up tomorrow morning and you heard a knock on the door and you opened it and there was an agent of the United States government.
Hear you on the internet.
And you were, this happens all the time, and you were opening the door and before you was an agent of the United States government and he said, Kelly, I know you own this beautiful natural prairie, but we want you to leave it and move to Oklahoma. Your response would be, we're in a church now, so don't get too crazy on me.
No.
Your response would be no. Firm, but no. And yet that is exactly the situation that Chief Standing Bear and 750 Ponca clustered in their winter village near the confluence of the Niobrara and Missouri rivers in January of 1877. That's exactly the situation they found themselves in. One of my favorite contemporary American writers is a Kentucky poet, essayist, very fine writer, our friend Mr. Wendell Berry. Does that name ring any bells with anybody? I see a lot of heads going north and south. Wendell Berry once wrote, if you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. And I love that sentence. I love the conciseness of those 12 words and the kick and the punch that that sentence has. If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. And you can think, excuse me, you can think among yourselves how place, how geography dramatically and powerfully informs who we are. Whether it's your neighborhood, whether it's your church, whether it's your city, whether it's your state, whether it's your region of the country, whether it's your country. All of those tributaries, place, flow into creating who you are and shaping how you see the world. And nobody, according to waves of ethnologists who swept across the Mississippi River in the post-Civil War era and began studying these exotic native peoples in this new branch of science, ethnology, not one of those tribes, according to these ethnologists who would spend months with these tribes and then come back to New York and compare notes, not one of them, according to the research I've done, which has been exhaustive, encountered any tribe west of the Mississippi that had sunk a deeper cultural taproot into its homeland than Standing Bear and those 750 Ponca now clustered near their winter village along the Niobrara and Missouri rivers. The Ponca knew who they were because they knew where they were. After all, they had lived at this beautiful part of Nebraska, which I'm sure a number of you have been to, for more than 200 years. They knew the Niobrara River. They knew the chalk bluffs above the Missouri River. They were able to transform year after year, generation after generation, this lush, beautiful valley into fields of pumpkin, corn, wheat, squash. And if it weren't for the Ponca's agricultural skills, there are many, many white settlers sweeping across the Mississippi after the Civil War who would not have survived Nebraska winters. The Ponca knew how to do this. They knew the deepest catfishing holes in the Niobrara River. They knew the individual rocks and the beautiful cottonwood trees that flanked those rivers. They had a sacred quality to them. And most of all, they knew the 7 sacred hills that surrounded their homeland, where they had lived for more than 200 years, where they buried their dead. And there is nothing more important to Native people, whether they're the Ponca in northeast Nebraska, the Hopi in the southwest, the Micmac in the northeast, than the places where they bury their dead. When the great Ogallala Lakota war chief Crazy Horse once was asked, "Where are your lands?" his response was simply, "My lands are where my fathers lie buried." So Standing Bear and these Ponca, in every fiber of their being, understood exactly what Wendell Berry meant when he said, if you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. So on a cold January day in 1877, into the winter village comes a complete stranger from all places the Upper East Side of New York, who has a message that was incomprehensible to Standing Bear and these 750 Ponca. The message was, the Great White Father back east wants you, all of you, to pick up and move to Oklahoma, to move to the Indian Territory that would morph into Oklahoma in 1907. Now we know that no Nebraskan is moving to Oklahoma. Not then, not now, not ever. Not happening. It's not happening. And Standing Bear said no. The other chief said no. All of the people said no. So 2 detachments of cavalry were sent down from Fort Randall. They slapped Standing Bear in handcuffs. They put him in leg shackles. They threw him and his brother, Big Snake, 6'4", 250 pounds, would have been an unbelievable defensive end at Nebraska, threw him in the back of a rickety buckboard wagon, ran him 70 miles up the Missouri River, and threw them in the stockade at Fort Randall. The government acknowledged that not only one U.S. treaty, but 2 U.S. Senate ratified treaties said this was the Ponca homeland. They legally occupied this homeland. So Standing Bear and Big Snake were in the stockade at Fort Randall. After 5 days, the government, because Standing Bear would not relent, Big Snake would not relent, they began withholding food from the 750 people. A couple of days later, they began withholding water. And after a few days, the very old and the very young began to weaken considerably. And Standing Bear and Big Snake were informed that the people, particularly the elders, the most valuable member of the tribe, in most native cultures, the older you are, the more valuable you are, the more social cachet you have. Very different from our culture, I would suggest. And when Standing Bear and Big Snake found out that the very old and the very young among their 750 villagers were severely weakened by the lack of food and water, they reluctantly agreed to do what the government wanted, which was to forsake their beloved homeland and start this 55-day journey over almost 600 miles that has almost a biblical feel to it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I tell you the 3 reasons I love this story. So they were marched with bayonets to their back from their beloved homeland in the Niobrara River all the way across Nebraska, all the way across Kansas, into Oklahoma, where they're unceremoniously dumped on the land. No food, no farming implements, no housing, no nothing. And most of the Ponca, these hardy, strong northern people used to cold winters, found themselves clustering in July of 1877 in these humid, hot creek bottoms, swarming with what? Carrying what? In 1 year, between July 1877 and July 1878, 1/3 of this hardy, robust tribe was dead. Sometimes entire families died in a week and were buried in this hated soil of this forced upon homeland. And the Ponca no longer knew who they were because they no longer knew where they were. They didn't recognize a lot of the trees. They didn't recognize a lot of the plants. They didn't recognize some of the animals. They had no sacred burial sites. They had heat, humidity, mosquitoes, malaria, and death, and nothing really to stop it. And then on Christmas week, 1878, Christmas week 1878, Standing Bear's only son, a 16-year-old boy by the name of Bear Shield, lay curled up in a fetal position on the bottom of a cheap army dank canvas tent, dying of malaria. Standing Bear had invested an enormous amount of energy and time and thought into Bear Shield because he, like every other chief of every other tribe west of the Mississippi in the last quarter of the 19th century, had to figure out a game plan for the chief's most fundamental job, which was to allow their people to survive. And Standing Bear had thought the best shot the Ponca had at surviving was Bear Shield, that he could be the bridge that would lead them to the future. So he sent him to the white man's school to learn the white man's language. He sent him to the white man's school to learn about the white man's political system. He sent him to missionaries to learn about the white man's God. And he thought if he had invested enough time, effort, and energy into educating his son about the New World Order, that Bear Shield could form this bridge across which the Ponca could walk with 1 foot in the New World Order and 1 foot in the past so they could retain their cultural identity. But on Christmas week of 1878, Bear Shield lay dying. And before his eyes closed in death, he extracted a promise from his father, the chief, that when he died, Standing Bear would take his body back and bury it in their beloved homeland, not in the hated soil of the Indian Territory. On the afternoon of January 2nd, 1879, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Standing Bear dressed his only son in his finest clothes, wrapped him in a buffalo robe, put him in the back of a rickety wagon, and he and 29 others, 11 men, 10 women, and 9 children, began walking from north central Oklahoma to the Nebraska-South Dakota border. On the day they left, January 2nd, 1879, the United States government had entered into 371 treaties with the native people of America. And on January 2nd, 1879, the United States government had broken all 371 treaties. But this middle-aged chief of this small, obscure tribe, hunkered down in this remote corner of the plains, was not going to break his promise to his son. This group of 30 Ponca had virtually no winter clothing, no money, no food, and they began walking. The day that they left, the air temperature, not the wind chill, the air temperature on the road ahead was 19 below zero. There was a fierce, I love saying that because there's a difference between saying it was 19 below zero and saying it was cold, if you're a writer. And mercifully, there is a warehouse on the University of Nebraska-Lincoln campus that has all of the weather records for the Great Plains region stretching back 150 years. So I could tell my researcher, I want you to go to this building. I want you to find out what the air temperature was on the afternoon of January 2nd, 1879, and I don't want to see you until you have the answer. I saw him within a couple of hours. 19 below zero. The third day they were out, January 4th, the blizzard coming in from Canada had intensified, and the wind chill on that third day out dropped to 77 below zero. They tunneled into haystacks at night and stuck the very old and the very young into these haystacks to keep them from freezing to death. The men would rummage for field corn during the day, burn it over an open fire, and they would go one day at a time, 1 week at a time, 1 month at a time, until they got within 2 days of the beloved homeland. And a detachment of soldiers out of Fort Omaha caught up with them. And they turned their faces south and marched them to Fort Omaha, not far from where we are now. Brigadier General George Crook, the highest-ranking military man west of the Mississippi, stood out on the porch of his home, which a number of you may have been to, beautiful home, as they were marched onto the lower parade ground. And he would later say in letters that it was a sight he never forgot, because he saw this bedraggled group of 30 men, women, and children come across the lower parade ground at Fort Omaha in late March of 1879. And one of the things that he never forgot was the clumps of flesh hanging off the elbows and the wrists of the women that looked like charred bacon because their skin was so dead from the frostbite of this journey. Something else I want to get back to a little bit later. This is where the story really gets interesting. This is such an Omaha story. This is such a Nebraska story, as the Reverend said earlier. But it's really, at its emotional center, it's an Omaha story. And what happened, the constellation of events set in motion when these 30 bedraggled Poncas streamed across the lower parade ground in late March of 1877, is why we need good stories. It echoes with all of the classic stories that we know about. And all kinds of things were set in motion just because this man, for reasons that I cannot understand, I actually bumped into Congressman Fortenberry on Friday, and he is a Standing Bear fanatic. And we sat down and had coffee for 30 minutes in the Cornhusker Hotel, and he had written me a letter last spring saying that he really loved the book and he really hated the book. And he couldn't get through it because he would get 20 pages, then 30 pages, and he would be so angry and so frustrated and so humiliated and so disgusted that it was messing with his head, and he'd just put it down and leave it for weeks at a time. But there is, on the back end of the story, the clouds begin to part and the sun comes out, and it's because of what happened in Omaha. It's because of the people in Omaha. It's because no matter what had happened to him, for reasons that I cannot fathom, Fortenberry cannot fathom, that this face of this middle-aged, devoted father never calcified into a face of hatred, anger, rage, and bitterness. How did he do that? I don't know. But he did, and that had a galvanizing effect, setting in motion all of these incredible dynamics that occurred a few miles from where we are right now. And I'll get into that a little bit later. One of the things it did ultimately was to get Standing Bear into the federal courthouse in Omaha, Nebraska, where he had his day in court. A site that many, many Omahans who had read about this case in the days preceding the trial and had come into this courthouse and packed it, and they saw for the first time in the 103-year history of the United States an American Indian sitting at the plaintiff's table and the highest-ranking military man west of the Mississippi sitting at the defendant's table. Standing Bear had sued the government of the United States, represented at that time by Brigadier General George Crook, alleging that the government had no legal reason whatsoever to detain his people in jail. And so they had this trial in this courthouse on 15th and Dodge Streets. Here's the second indiscretion that writers often are guilty of. They read too much. They read too long. They bore the audience to tears. With your permission, I would like to read 1 1/4 page from the book, not one more paragraph, about how this trial climaxed late on the evening of May 2nd, 1879. Do I have your permission? Thank you. 1 1/4 pages. I wouldn't dare lie in a church. Before the crowd began to file out, the judge made an announcement. Although the trial now had officially ended and the legal proceedings were over, one last speaker, he said, had asked permission to address the court. He supposed it was the first time in the nation's history such a request had been made, but he had decided to grant it, and he had earlier informed all of the lawyers of his intention to do so. So the crowd settled back down and turned its attention to the front of the courtroom. They all saw him rise slowly from his seat, and they could see the eagle feather and the braided hair wrapped in otter fur, the bold blue shirt trimmed in red cloth, the blue flannel leggings and deerskin moccasins, the red and blue blanket, the Thomas Jefferson medallion, the necklace of bear claws. When Standing Bear got to the front, he stopped and faced the audience and extended his right hand, holding it still for a very long time. After a while, he turned to the judge, and he began to speak in a low voice, his words conveyed to the judge and the large crowd by the Omaha Indian poet Bright Eyes. That hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If you pierce your hand, you will also feel pain. The blood that will flow from mine is the same color of yours. I am a man. The same God made us both. Then Standing Bear turned and faced the audience, pausing for a moment, staring in silence out a courtroom window, describing after a time what it was when he looked out that window. I seemed to stand on the bank of a river. My wife and little girl are beside me. In front, the river is wide and impassable. He sees there are steep cliffs all around. The water's rapidly rising. In desperation, he scans the cliffs and finally spots a steep, rocky path to safety. I turn to my wife and child with a shout, "We are saved! We are saved!" We will return to the swift running water that pours down between the green islands of our homeland. There lie the graves of my fathers. So they hurriedly climb the path, getting closer and closer to safety. The water's rushing in behind them. But a man bars the passage. If he says that I cannot pass, then I cannot. The long struggle will have been in vain. My wife and child and I must return and sink beneath the flood. We are weak and faint and sick. I cannot fight. Standing Bear stopped and turned, facing the judge, again speaking softly. You are that man. In the crowded courtroom, no one spoke or moved for several moments. After a while, a few women could be heard crying in the back, and some of the people up closer could see that the grizzled frontier judge had temporarily lost his composure and that the general, too, was leaning forward on the table, his face buried in his hands. Soon, some people began to clap, and a number of others started cheering, and then the general got up from his chair and went over and shook Standing Bear's hand. And before long, a number of others had done the same. So the bailiffs asked for order, and when it finally grew quiet again, the judge said he would take the case under advisement and issue his decision in a few days. And then he adjourned the court shortly after 10 o'clock on a warm spring evening on the 2nd of May, 1879. Happened just blocks from where we are. I got an email not this summer, but in the summer of 2012, I got an email from a middle-aged woman in San Diego who said that she and two of her friends would go religiously to their health club in San Diego every morning, Monday through Friday. And one morning, she was reading the book, and she brought the book with her, and she was on her treadmill, which was normal, and she was reading the book, and she was reading the book, and she got to the passage that I just read. And in her email, she said the next thing she knew, she was flat on the floor of her health club, writhing in pain because she had severely torn up her shoulder. and that her two friends scrambled over and got her and took her to the emergency room, and she had to wear a sling/cast for 6 weeks. And she said in the email that she had gotten so fully absorbed in that moment. That's what you're trying to do when you're writing. You're trying to get the reader in the moment. Not to the point where they injure themselves. But I did tell my researcher in this new book project we're working on, we need to look for those treadmill moments. They're there. We just have to keep peeling away the layer of research until we find those treadmill moments. That's the narrative arc of the story, at least as far as I can go right now. So I want to pivot out of that, and I want to give you concisely 3 specific reasons why this, over the course of 2.5 years that it took to do, and in some of the blowback afterwards, why this became my Moby Dick. When you write a newspaper story, I'm going to use a running analogy since we were talking about treadmills. I will just keep the running metaphor alive and well. When you're writing newspaper stories, which I have written probably thousands of newspaper stories, it's the equivalent of running the 100-yard dash. When you write a magazine article, it's more or less the equivalent of running the mile. But when you write a book and you carve out 2.5 years of your life and you obsess over it 24/7, it's the equivalent of running a literary marathon. And before you embark on the literary marathon, you have to stack the deck in your favor so you have the octane to push past that 11-mile marker, that 16-mile marker, that 23-mile marker. You have to have 2 things going for you. Because even if those are going for you, there are so many times in the course of that journey where you can't risk walking past an open window on the 2nd, 3rd floor of a building. 2 things that you have to have. One is you have to have this incredibly embedded belief that this is a powerful, important story. That it's a powerful story. That it's got a message to give. That it's not outdated. That it's not some story encased in mothballs and stuck on the shelves of the 19th century. You've got to have that ironclad belief embedded in you. And you have to marry that belief that this is a profoundly powerful, important story. You have to marry that with a whiff of arrogance. Not only is it a great story, but nobody could tell it better than you. Or at least nobody would be willing to open their wrists and bleed for this story to the extent that you would. You have to be able to do that. And one of the very first things you have to do in evaluating, well, is this a good story? Is this a powerful story? One of the very first things you have to do is almost in a literary microscopic way, you have to take that story, put it under a microscope, and start finding out whether or not it has a constellation of powerful themes that you can braid together into a narrative quilt that is going to keep you from twitching your thumbs furiously from beginning to middle to end. Many of us, I suspect, have been conditioned to believe, you want to find themes? Good. Go read Mr. William Shakespeare. Go read Mr. Dostoevsky. Go read Mr. Ernest Hemingway. That's where you're going to find good themes. But I am here to conclusively tell you that you do not have to schlep across some dreary Scottish moor. You don't have to trudge down some frozen St. Petersburg street. You don't have to trundle across some bloody bullring to find a story with good themes. This story is chock-a-block with all kinds of themes. This is a story about love of country, about love of family, about love of homeland, about honor, courage, perseverance, integrity. Enough themes for any writer to be able to finish that marathon. On the 3rd day, of their forced march from their homeland, going from the Nebraska-South Dakota border to Oklahoma. It was a very tumultuous spring from a weather front. There was some snow, there was rain, there was all kinds of cold, there was wind. They endured 2 tornadoes. And then they got this blast of staggering heat and humidity when they got to Oklahoma. But on the 3rd day out, in this unusually cold, wet, chilly spring, a 6-month-old baby girl by the name of White Buffalo Girl died of pneumonia just after they had crossed the Elkhorn River outside of Neely, Nebraska. White Buffalo Girl's mother was so emotionally destroyed that she couldn't do anything but just clutch her dead baby to her breast, kneeling down on the bottom of this tent for 4 hours, just wailing uncontrollably. Incomprehensible to her that in 3 days she had lost her home and now her daughter. And after 4 hours, she begged her husband to go into the town of Neely, Nebraska, to ask the military commander if he would find the town carpenter, and if the town carpenter could build a small wooden coffin for White Buffalo Girl and a cross. And her husband found the military commander. The military commander went into Neely. He found the town carpenter. And about 2 o'clock, in a slight drizzle, the entire town of Neely came out to bury White Buffalo Girl. And if we were somehow able to be magically transported right now to the Laurel Hill Cemetery outside of Neely, Nebraska, you would see a cemetery that has 3 sweeping hills set high above the Elkhorn River Valley. And you would also notice among the more than 800 graves spread across these 3 sweeping hills, there's only one in the year 2013 that's allowed to have flowers on it all year round. White Buffalo Girl's grave. And if we were somehow able to talk to Mr. Laverne Houtman, the Vice President of the Antelope County Historical Society, and we were able to say, Laverne, okay, I know that White Buffalo Girl's father begged you to treat his daughter as though she were one of your own. And you promised back in 1877 that you would do so. We get it if you fulfilled that promise for 20 years, 30 years, even 50 years. But more than 135 years later, you still are honoring that pledge. You still allow only this grave to have flowers on it all year round. You invite mothers from all over northeast Nebraska on Mother's Day to bring their young daughters to the gravesite and tell them the story about White Buffalo Girl. What gives? And he would look you dead in the eye and he would say, we thought it was the Christian thing to do back in 1877, and we still think it's the Christian thing to do, and we don't ever see that changing. Laverne is 87. That's a story that any mother, anywhere in the world, Tierra del Fuego, Vladivostok, Stockholm, I don't care where you are, Yemen, Nigeria, there is no mother and really no father anywhere in the world who doesn't understand that universal theme. And that's what you're trying to find. And that's what this story has to offer. And that's one of the reasons I love it. It has such great universal themes naturally embedded in the narrative. They're so powerful that your job as a writer, which is a very difficult thing to do, even for writers who've been writing for a long time, when you have a story like this that has these kind of universal themes and the power of just the narrative arc of the story, your job as the writer is to get out of the way of the story, to let that story come as directly and unfiltered to the reader as possible. Because the second that story has your thumbprints on it, the second you try and use too many adjectives, the second you try and hyperventilate over this story, you screw it up. You ruin it. Get out of the way of these kinds of stories. That's what I tried to do. You can be the judge of whether or not I succeeded. The second reason I love this story is just because the unbelievable cast of characters that are braided into the story, almost all of whom occupied Omaha, Nebraska in the spring of 1879. Nothing like this had ever happened in the history of the United States. The people that came out of the woodwork, that stepped out of the shadows to begin rallying around Standing Bear's flag, this 52-year-old chief of this small tribe, was unprecedented. And they were, what a spectacular cavalcade of characters they were. All Omaha, born and raised for the most part. Brigadier General of the United States, George Crook, who had gotten a telegram shortly after his prisoners had arrived, bedraggled though may be, from his superior, Lieutenant General Philip Sheridan, directly ordering Crook to turn their faces south and march them straight back to Oklahoma. Didn't care how desperate they were, how sick they were, how weak they were. He did not want this group of 30 Ponca to set any precedent, giving the other tribes in Oklahoma the idea that they too could go back home as Standing Bear did. George Crook was a West Point graduate. George Crook was a heavily decorated Civil War veteran. George Crook had basically spent, except for those 4 years in the Civil War, his entire adult life fighting Indians and following orders. But sometime in late March 1879, and I always imagine him on the second floor of this magnificent stone house overlooking the lower prairie, I can just see him going back and forth, pacing, in this intense battle between his military conscience and his civilian conscience. And that needle just flitting back and forth, defy an order from, of all people, Sheridan, who a few years earlier had famously said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Are you kidding me? I'll be court-martialed. I'll be stripped of everything I have. Or I can do something with my civilian conscience that will keep these people alive. And I can see that needle going back and forth until one night in late March, it just tipped ever so slightly on the civilian side. He goes down to the stable, he saddles up his horse after midnight under the cover of darkness, rides 3 miles south, knocks on the door of the Omaha Daily Herald, which would soon become the Omaha World Herald, and it's opened by the assistant editor, a man he knows, a larger-than-life megalomaniac who did have a pure social justice heart by the name of Thomas Henry Tibbles. And George Crook says to his friend, the newspaper man, Tom, I think I've got a story you're going to be interested in. Now, I've been a journalist for almost 30 years. And for 30 years, I have been waiting for a brigadier general to tweet me, Facebook me, befriend me, email me, knock on my door and lay that kind of a story. Hasn't happened, not holding my breath. Don't think it's going to happen at this point. But it did happen. It did happen in Omaha, Nebraska, late March 1879. Spectacular character. How about Andrew Jackson Poppleton? You can't make these names up. Andrew Jackson Poppleton. I'm guessing you've seen Poppleton Street in Omaha before. Well, in the spring of 1879, if you were in trouble with the law anywhere in Nebraska, the one man you would want in your corner is the silver-haired, silver-tongued orator by the name of Andrew Jackson Poppleton. He was the first man admitted to the bar in Nebraska. He was a former state legislator. He was a former mayor of Omaha. And in May of 1879, he was the general counsel, ironically, of the Union Pacific Railroad, the one institution that had probably done more to ruin indigenous culture than anything else. And he got whiff of this story, and he wanted to be a part of it. So he agrees to represent Standing Bear pro bono, for free. He was intrigued by the constitutional possibilities inherent in this case. So the brigadier general defies an order to tip off the newspaper man, who begins writing these crusading stories on behalf of Standing Bear and the Ponca that attracts the attention of the most powerful lawyer in Omaha, who agrees to represent this chief for free, Bishop Clarkson, another name I'm guessing resonates with at least 3 people, setting the bar pretty low in this room. He is furious at the government's treatment, and he starts firing off these telegrams to these pointy-headed bureaucrats in Washington that would make Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert envious with the sheer sarcasm dripping from his telegrams, which went something like, I know we're just a bunch of rubes out here. We're not nearly as smart as you people on the East Coast, but I just want somebody back east to try and square this for me. How exactly are we supposed to Christianize these people on the one hand and treat them as the devil on the other? We're not smart enough to figure that out, but we know you can, so tell us. While he was waiting for the powerful intellectual giants on the East Coast to square this for him, he began this food and clothing drive up and down the eastern corridor of Nebraska for the Ponca people. These 30 starving, bedraggled, freezing Ponca, and the outpouring of food and clothing was unbelievable. The Jewish community of Omaha. The Jewish community of Omaha steps out of the shadows in the spring of 1879, and they start hitting up white people for money to defend an American Indian. Do you think that happened every week in the 1800s? Happened once. Omaha, Nebraska, May 1879. So another thing that really is in your favor is if you have a powerful story laden with great themes and populated by spectacular characters. That's another reason you can love this book and get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. The last reason is different. The last reason is metaphorical. I can prove the first 2 reasons. I can prove that this is a book loaded with universal themes. They can be identified, laid out for you. I can prove this book is populated with a spectacular array of characters. They're all right there. We know who they are. Biographies have been written about them. The third reason is not subject to that kind of almost scientific scrutiny. But I believe if I had enough time, I nevertheless could prove it to be true. After Standing Bear was declared by this grizzled, frontier, Indian-hating judge, Elmer Dundee, in mid-May of 1879, a judge who declared for the first time in the history of the United States, from this point forward, Standing Bear and people who look like him are to be considered as a person within the meaning of the law, entitled to the same constitutional privileges as the more fortunate white race. After that judgment came down on the second floor of that monolithic limestone courthouse, 15th and Dodge Streets, it wasn't long after that that Standing Bear, the amazing, really, Omaha Indian poet Bright Eyes, the crusading journalist Thomas Henry Tibbles, and Bright Eyes' brother, the 4 of them, began an extended speaking tour across the United States, the eastern half of the United States, mostly on the East Coast. Many newspapers by this time had picked up Tibble's story, and there was an electrified group of citizens on the East Coast who were outraged at the treatment of this father who just wanted to bury his son. These were abolitionists in earlier days. And with the passage of the 14th Amendment, which had technically resolved the issue of slavery, they were looking for a new cause. And they found it in their newspapers. The cause was Standing Bear and the effort to bury his son. So they began this extended tour. First it went to Chicago, then Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. And they spoke before large gatherings of people. And what I am going to suggest is that for 2 days, Standing Bear was on the witness stand in Omaha at the courthouse. And for 2 days, a young, brash federal prosecutor trying his first case in federal court by the name of Genio Lambertson was in Standing Bear's face, machine gun style, peppering him with these questions. Who are you? What does it mean to be a Ponca? Does your tribe swear allegiance to you? What do your people believe in? Who is your God? What would you do if we set you free and let you go back home? Bang, bang, bang like that for 2 days. What happened in this extended summer, fall, and winter speaking tour that Standing Bear was the prominent player on is, I would argue, for the first time in our country, what Standing Bear did before packed halls in Boston and in Chicago and in New York and in Washington, D.C., before congressional committees in Washington, D.C., what Standing Bear did, metaphorically, was he held up a mirror. He held up a mirror to the United States of America and forced its citizens to look into that mirror, and he was asking the questions. He was asking America and Americans, who am I? No, who are you? And what is this system you have called democracy? And who is your God? And what does your God believe in? And in the end, he did something that is, as we would all agree, I think, exceedingly rare, extraordinarily rare, which is, by the time he was finished, by the time this case had run its course, he had made Americans better than they thought they could be. He had set a bar and asked them to clear it at a height they didn't know they could jump. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do. Not many people can do it. So, in closing, suppose that we had a table up here, a table of mythological American history heroes. Suppose I handed out ballots to everybody in this room. Suppose I gave you, 3 votes as to who you were going to put at our mythological table of American history heroes. And suppose I gathered up all the votes and tabulated them. Who would we find sitting at this table? This table up here. Mythological table of American history heroes. I'm going to go out on a limb, get really reckless and crazy, and say after I've tabulated your votes, I am guessing that that resolute rail splitter from Illinois is going to grab a seat at our table. Just a hunch. I'm going to guess that that celebrated kite flyer from Philadelphia is going to have a seat at the table. I'm guessing that the man who wrote those celebrated letters of freedom from his jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, is going to be at our table. And I'm guessing that that woman who on December 1st, 1955, after a day of washing somebody else's dirty laundry, after a day of ironing somebody else's wrinkled laundry, after a day of washing somebody else's dirty dishes and cleaning their dirty house, and when she got on that bus at 5 o'clock that afternoon in Montgomery, Alabama, she just wanted to sit down and rest her weary bones. And she had no sooner done so when she was asked to stand up and give her seat to a white man. And she replied with a single word, which was, she's going to be at this table. And I'm just saying, it would not shame me, it would not embarrass me in any way, shape, or form if we, as Americans, were to approach this mythological table of American history heroes and we saw an empty chair with a brass nameplate above it that said simply, reserved Chief Standing Bear. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think, according to our contract, I have fulfilled my end of the bargain. So you all know what your duties are. We've got the lawyers right here.
Question over here. I wanted to ask you why the story that has the great themes and the great characters spoke to you so heavily. Do you have a Native American background? I know you grew up in Lincoln, but how did you even get turned on to the story of the great themes and great characters?
Well, everybody heard the question. No, I have Sicilian blood, which is a whole nother tribe. I grew up in Nebraska, like many of you, I suspect, and there isn't a specific answer to that question on one level. I think when you grow up in Nebraska, you get exposed to the rather large footprint that Native Americans have left on this state. Now, that either resonates or it doesn't. And for me, it's something that started clicking at a very early age, and it's never stopped clicking. I think when I was 8 or 9, I was furious with my parents that we weren't Native American. I could think of nothing more wonderful than being an Indian. You got to ride horses. You got to shoot a bow and arrow. You got to shoot a gun. You got to sleep outside. You didn't have to go to school. You could start fires and nobody'd call the cops. What's not to like? And then I got a little older and presumably a little more sophisticated, and I really am fascinated by this culture and the value system of this culture and the history of this culture. And it's a culture, I don't know what your hobbies are. I suspect we have some gardeners here. I suspect we have some hunters and fishermen here. I suspect we have people who like quilts and make quilts. One of the things that I guess I would say is one of my hobbies is I collect stories. I don't know why. I've always liked stories. In 6th grade, we were supposed to write a 3-page biography of some person we really liked, and I wrote a 47-page biography of Crazy Horse. I don't know why. There's just something about that story and something about Native Americans and their stories and their history that I find endlessly fascinating, and that had to spring from the soil of Nebraska and the exposure. I mean, how many states can you name west of the Mississippi that are not an Indian word? Bet you can't name 4. So it's here, it's everywhere, it's in the air. And if you have your radio turned to the native frequency, it's only a matter of time before that frequency pulls in the Standing Bear story. It's only a matter of time before you encounter that. And I happen to have a very good friend, a couple of people in this room know her, Judy Goshkabosh, Executive Director of the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, Ponk on her mother's side, Dakota on her father's side, and I just cornered her one day about 5 or 6 years ago, asked if she had an hour for lunch because I wanted to backfill the details of the Standing Bear story. I kind of knew the basic beginning, middle, and end, and so she agreed to go to lunch, and 4 hours later we emerged from this Mexican restaurant in the Haymarket, and I knew walking out in the sunlight that afternoon that the first thing I had to do was rearrange the furniture in my life so I could just attack this story like a wild man. It's kind of what I did. I don't know if that even comes close to answering the question, but it's the best I can do.
We have a question in the back.
Or comments.
Thank you so much for bringing that story to life. It's fabulous. I happen to be one of the lawyers in the room and remember the case in law school abstractly without knowing how rich it really is. And I just want to give you a little feedback. I also happen to teach a civil rights class and have used this book recently, and even though kids often have their noses buried in their phones and their tablets, it resonated. Even today, it was so powerful. And so, again, thank you for that. I guess my question is, since you've published the book and had the success and notoriety, has there been any effort to commemorate the story more dramatically? I mean, I could envision, almost a whole museum, dedicated to the story. But I just wonder if you...
Yes, and I can give you a very specific answer, and the answer is yes. Number one, I told you that I bumped into Congressman Fortenberry last Friday. Get this. and this has been in the works really for going on a year. We essentially have a conservative white Republican congressman from Nebraska who is teaming up with a black liberal civil rights icon in Georgia by the name of John Lewis to get federal money to commemorate Standing Bear, an American Indian, with a trail that marks the journey from South Dakota, Nebraska border to Oklahoma. And it's going to happen. It will happen. There are lots of people who have been working feverishly behind the scenes to create a kind of 21st century, I mean, they've got wild stuff on their drawing board. I mean, that you will be able to dial it in with cell phones. They've got all kinds of plans, and they're really down in the weeds doing the research, pulling every newspaper, contemporaneous articles of the Seward, Independent, Milford, Beatrice, all the places they went by, and they're reconstructing the trail, and it's going to happen. Fortenberry and Lewis are absolutely dead serious about this, and they are going to make it happen. That's one thing. There's a screenplay being written. Whether or not it comes to pass, who knows? The third thing, and this is where you come in, I cannot believe that there is not a statue prominently displayed somewhere in this town where lots of eyeballs can see it, dedicated to Standing Bear. I just can't comprehend that. I'm talking about a 7-foot bronze statue somewhere in the old market where you have all of these events, NCAA volleyball, national tournaments, NCAA swimming events, College World Series, Bruce Springsteen, I don't know, whoever plays at the arena. Why, it doesn't make sense to me. That has to happen. That is so doable. I mean, this city is loaded. People could reach into their, about 5 people could reach into their pockets and the statue would be funded just like that. And to imagine walking by, I'm making something up, 12th and Harney, and Ma and Pa from Oregon are going to the College World Series to see their son, and they pass this statue, and there's a plaque on it that says, in May of 1879, for the first time in the history of the United States, an Indian was accorded his civil rights. 5 blocks of, I'm directionally challenged, 5 blocks in some direction from where you are right now. I mean, how complicated is that? Is there a more interesting story that Omaha has given birth to in its history that works on so many levels? Legal, social, historical, political. Maybe there is, but I can't think of one. So I just think that's something that needs to happen. That statue would be so compelling for all of these people who I've given variations of this talk at the National Museum of the American Indian in New York, at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., where Friday afternoon, where Justice Sotomayor came and asked for a copy of the book, and I gave it to her, and she wrote me in a handwritten letter a couple of weeks later saying she'd never heard this story, and she was just fascinated by it. International Book Festival in Miami. People coming up after the talk and are angry, saying, why is it that I graduated from college and I've never heard this story before? So what's wrong with a statue in the old market when the Oregon people and the LSU people and people from literally all over the country walk from La Bouvette to the stadium and pass this statue and see a plaque with a single sentence on it that commemorates this man, this event, this city, this state, this country? I'm preaching. I'm sorry. Yes, I stand corrected.
We have a question here.
Joe Ann Hubbard.
Hi, Ann.
So why don't more people know about what happened to this story, that it seems like such an important civil rights story that it died, was my first question. And then my second was that I question, it's more like the evolution of things. Can you talk a little bit about your evolution to the Native Daughters?
Oh, yes. Okay, first question is, why did this not get the legs that you ordinarily would suspect? The government did, the answer is the government did a really smart thing. They decided not to appeal Judge Elmer Dundee's verdict and chop it off in Omaha and not let it get to the Supreme Court. Had it got to the Supreme Court and the government lost, we all would have read about this story more than likely, certainly in law school, and probably in all of our 11th grade American history classes. But the government very deliberately and very strategically wanted to localize it and not expand an Omaha federal judge's ruling from sea to shining sea, and they feared that's exactly what would happen if they challenged it and it somehow did make its way to the Supreme Court. That's my best answer to that. The answer to Ann's second question was introducing the concept of native daughters into the conversation, and that is a reference to, I actually have a copy of it. It's so, this is a project that a dozen of our hand-picked best students out of 900 majors in the College of Journalism, we cherry-picked the 12 best students with specific skill sets: research, writing, videography, web design. We blended them into a class that sprawled over 3 semesters, and they created this magazine called Native Daughters. Back at the mic. And this is a 3-month effort that celebrates the vital role that Native American women have played in sustaining and enriching these ancient cultures forever. This magazine has done things and gone places that nothing that the College of Journalism has ever produced in its history has done before. This is now the primary Title VII Indian education tool in the public school systems in Minneapolis, Denver, and Portland. This magazine, we got an order for 50 magazines from the University of Beijing. They used it last summer as the primary teaching tool because the Chinese are really fascinated with American Indians. We have no advertising budget, no public relations. We don't even know how these people find out about this. We've gotten orders from Sicily. Some poet in Sicily wanted to use it in her class in Palermo. It's just been amazing what has happened. There is a woman in Tulsa, Oklahoma, by the name of Jeanette Overall. And a year and a half ago, her tribal chairman gave her a copy of the magazine. She's the CEO of this generator company, Creek Muskogee, native woman, early 50s. She called me up and she started to say that she started flipping through this magazine, and 2 sentences into the conversation, this is a total stranger, she just broke down and started weeping uncontrollably. And she said, "I'm 53 years old, a Muskogee Creek Indian woman, self-made woman, self-taught woman, and I have never picked up anything, or I have never seen anything in which I could see myself in the publication. It's always about the men." How true, right? It's always about the men. It's always about Geronimo. It's always about Sitting Bull. It's always about Red Cloud. It's always about Crazy Horse. This is the first time I have ever seen anything, 140 pages, that is devoted exclusively to who I am and to my ancestors and to all those Cherokee mothers who walked from Georgia to the Indian Territory, carrying their babies on their back through 1.5 feet of snow and somehow survived and kept their culture going through disease, alcoholism, loss of land, extreme poverty. It says on the cover, Native Daughters, who they are, where they've been, and why Indian country could never survive without them. And on the back, there's an epigraph, an old Cheyenne proverb that is the emotional center of this whole 3-month project, 3-semester project. And the Cheyenne proverb is, a nation is not conquered until the souls of its women lay on the ground. And it's just been unbelievable what has happened. And so this woman composed herself, regained her composure, and on the back end of the conversation, she said, if I were to write you a personal check for $150,000, would you do a second Native Daughters magazine focusing on the Native American women of Oklahoma? And I'm pretty sure there's not a chronometer built that can measure time in nanoseconds. But if there were, this would have clocked in at about 3. Yes, I think we can do that. We'll soldier on. She sent us a check for $150,000. We are in the 3rd and final semester, 6 weeks away from wrapping up a second Native Daughters magazine that will in fact be concentrated on the incredible contribution of Native American women in Oklahoma. In Nebraska, we have 4 federally recognized tribes: Ponca, Pawnee, Santee, Omaha, not the Pawnee, Santee, Omaha, Winnebago, and Ponca. In Oklahoma, they have 39 federally recognized tribes. So it's the greatest concentration of Native tribal culture of any state in the United States. So this second magazine that will come out in early February will be devoted to this amazing array of women, from Wilma Mankiller, the first principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, to Joy Harjo, this amazing jazz musician, to LaDonna Harris, who was the wife of longtime Oklahoma Senator Fred Harris, lived next to Bobby Kennedy for 15 years in McLean, Georgia, to Angel Goodrich, All-American point guard for the University of Kansas, who is now going to Russia to play professional basketball. So she's from the reservation, Cherokee Reservation in Tahlequah, All-American point guard at the University of Kansas, heading to Russia within the next week to start a professional career. So we tried to get a good demographic, all the different age groups, the elders and the young and everybody in between, and it's quite an array of women and what they have done for their cultures and what they have done. The biggest problem that many of you know, one of the biggest problems on American Indian reservations are the lack of role models. And what these American Indian women have done, who are profiled in the second Native Daughters magazine in Oklahoma, it's just an astonishing array of the power of their culture and how important the women are. The glue in these cultures. Without them, there is no culture. Without them, I'm convinced many of these tribes would have just withered on the vine and would no longer be with us. And that's what these stories are about. It's hard for me to give a short answer when I get started on Native Daughter, because I just love this project. And it has had such an amazing response.
We have one last question.
I just wanted to make a statement. I'm Suzanne Arney. And one other reason that not more people heard about it outside of Nebraska is that when Nebraska had a chance to put an image on the quarter, on the state quarter, Standing Bear was one of the choices. And we chose Chimney Rock. We could have had everybody in the country looking at that image. And when you talk about having a statue put up downtown, I think that a highly trafficked area, like you mentioned, would be an obvious and a great choice. But also 15th and Dodge, we could put the statue up there with those wonderful cavorting buffalo and
Cavorting, that's a good word.
covered wagons coming through. Thank you for your talk.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for your comments. Was that the last question?
Yes.
Okay. I sometimes, I don't know why. I got one last thing to say, and then I will let you go. But I sometimes feel a little sheepish about saying this, and I don't know why, and there's no reason why I should. But at any rate, I've started a scholarship fund in honor of Chief Standing Bearer. It's called the Chief Standing Bearer Journey for Justice Scholarship Fund. And this scholarship fund is parked underneath the umbrella of the Nebraska Community Foundation, 501c3. All the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed. And the point of this scholarship fund is to send each year, starting in the spring of 2015, to send as many qualified Nebraska Native American high school graduates on to a post-secondary education route of some kind. And I'm being very broad in how I define that. I don't care if they use it to graduate from a beauty salon school. I don't care if it's nursing college. I don't care if it's auto mechanics. I don't care if it's law school, med school, journalism. I don't care what it is. But there is a pool of Native American graduates in this state who have the academic chops to succeed at the next level, but are desperately poor. And this is going to be a bridge to get them from their communities to a position where they can have a trade, where they can have a skill that's going to create a job, that's going to generate a paycheck, that's going to support a family, and in turn, they will become the role models in that family. And this isn't theory. I know this has happened in practice, and there are many examples of it. And so I am also going to certainly let you have the option. I have a flyer that just lays this out in about 10 paragraphs of why I think this is important. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln has 7 times more students from India than they do Indians. I have nothing against students from India, but I think there's just something fundamentally wrong for the state's flagship university that is a Oto word meaning flat water that has this paucity of Native American students. And my goal is $125,000, and I have $105,000. And as I was saying to Margaret before, the way this $105,000 has come in, it's one of the 3 greatest things that has ever happened to me personally. It's strictly, by design, a Nebraska grassroots effort. And the number of people, the unyielding, unbending generosity of Nebraskans who have created all these tributaries from an individual who wants to remain anonymous who gave me $25,000 to last May 5th giving a talk similar to this at the Grand Island Public Library. And it was in a room next to the main room, and midway through I saw this bag lady come through with her cart filled with cans and plastic and clothing, came into this room, parked in the corner, listened to the last half of the talk, listened about this scholarship fund, and it was a cold, raw, windy day, followed me out into the parking lot, and stuck out her hand, and I could see there was something in it, and so I reached and took her hand, and what was in her hand were 2 of the dirtiest, most wrinkled, crumpled up $1 bills that I'm sure I've ever seen. And she just looked at me in the middle of that parking lot, dead in the eyes, and said, "I really wish I could give you more, but that's all I have." And I tried to give it back to her, and she wouldn't take it. And I didn't do it a second time because, as slow as I am, it did click that, no, she really meant it. She really wanted me to have those dirty, crinkled, rumpled up $1 bills to put into this fund. And that's where they went. So again, I thank you very much, and I apologize for running over time, but I think we both successfully fulfilled our contract. Have we not, Counselor? Okay. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you for joining us tonight. We certainly hope to see you again. Please check out the website for a list of upcoming events and speakers. Give Joe a moment to leave the sanctuary and get situated at the signing table, and then he's happy to have a conversation and sign books and join us for refreshments. Thank you all very much for coming.